pressure. Just to be clear, we haven't actually been studying for 3.5 years. I just want to add that in. Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Lella Nouri. For those who I haven't met today, I am a third-year PhD student, and as Stuart has mentioned, I'm part of the project. And what I'd like to do today is kind of give a snapshot of my PhD, so kind of what my research has been about, where I am with my empirical research so far. Due to the time constraints, which I'm realising are incredibly strict, I'm just going to focus on a couple of aspects of the research that I've done so far. So I look at 3 US presidencies, Bill Clinton, George Bush and Barack Obama, but I'm just going to talk about Bill Clinton and George Bush today and how they've presented the cyberterrorism threat. So what I hope to do through this presentation is first demonstrate kind of the theoretical and methodological commitments of my research. Second, outline the purpose of this research, so where this fits in the kind of wider framework of terrorism studies. I'm very aware that we're not all from the same discipline here, so whilst there might be a bit of overlap for some of you, hopefully it will make why this is important to me clearer. And then finally outline some of my findings into how cyberterrorism has been written as a national security issue in US political discourse. So first I give a brief account of the theoretical and methodological framework. Second, I'll demonstrate where this research is situated. And then I move on to outline the main part of this presentation, which is an outline of 3 key articulatory moments identified in the official writing of cyberterrorism in US political discourse. And these are temporal discontinuity, open borders and new threats, and the presented contrast between the benefits of and threats from information technology. And then I'll conclude by kind of introducing a discussion of how this construction of cyberterrorism forms part of a broader framework that I think creates space for writing both cyberterrorists and the US response, which is part of my research kind of wider objectives. So, what is my theoretical framework? Well, when I talk of discourse, I guess that's where I should start really, I'm adopting Ernest Laclau and Chantal's MOOFs approach, which is formulated on the premise that the social world does not possess any foundation or definitive ground. So in this way, meanings and understandings are the result of discursive conditions, or language if you like, that form their meaning. So this can include social, historical and political formations, and these all kind of form their construction. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with my research. So what Laclau and MOOF's discourse theory allows me to do is take the symbolic and discursive construction of cyberterrorism as an object of analysis, without kind of putting this as a secondary concern to kind of the things we've been talking about today. Is this a threat, etc. So my study then into cyberterrorism identifies how, what and why certain political factors influence the meanings and understandings attributed to cyberterrorism in US political discourse specifically. But you could do this, I guess, with any political discourse. I was originally going to do a US and UK comparative study, but then I realised that was an incredible amount of data, so I'm just focusing on the US. And through this, I'll also demonstrate how cyberterrorism emerged on the national security agenda as a result of political decisions. And I'll come back to what I mean by that in a little bit. So the other thing which I think is important to mention, which can become a bit confusing, I guess, is that Laclau and MOOF's approach is somewhat different to some of the discourse analysis that other people within critical terrorism studies have adopted, in that it does not seek to reveal a truth behind the narratives. So what I'm not looking to do is say, the US presidents created this threat, actually this is what I think is real. What I want to do is just reveal how these conclusions came about, and from that kind of reveal that there are alternatives and that kind of thing. So in practice then, my research involves a deconstruction of the cyberterrorism discourse. And my understanding of deconstruction follows Jack Derrida's understanding, which focuses on the undecidability of discourse and its ability to adapt and change. So discourses are not closed. They depend upon socio-historical conditions, upon non-natural relations of power, that by essence are mobile and founded upon complex conventional structures. So for Derrida, for example, deconstruction allows for the destabilization of such structures to open up the text to alternative meanings, which obviously then fits in with the normative commitments of the clown move. So just a few words on methodology then. As I've already mentioned, I focus on 3 US presidents. Well, why these 3? Well, firstly, in terms of time frame, 1993 to 2012 is what I look at in a broader space. And I start with the Clinton administration, as it's during kind of the late 1990s that the internet and changes in information technology really started to affect kind of US discourse and policy. So that's kind of the reason for that. 2012, well, I couldn't just keep carrying on. I want to finish my PhD, so that's kind of the reason for that. And within that, I've also limited it to a certain number of texts and a certain specific set of search criteria. Firstly, because there are so many, I had so much to choose from that I had to kind of limit it in that way. And secondly, I don't think that this is a problem, because I think by taking a very, very small snapshot like that, I'm able to provide a clearer picture of the presentation of cyberterrorism within a broader discourse. So, focusing on presidential discourse in particular, so text, speeches from the White House, so these include speeches, testimonies, interviews, policy documents from the president, but also key White House representatives, I think gives me a broad view of how this has been constructed from the outset. So in other sites of discourse, such as the media, they are then reproduced. So in my eyes, this is the best place to start in terms of deconstructing cyberterrorism. Hopefully that makes kind of sense. Okay, so where does this research fit in terms of academic discussions? Well, some people might argue with me, I think, but I situate this research in the ever-growing movement within terrorism studies to more critical research. So I think Maura's touched on it a little bit earlier, called critical terrorism studies, which seeks to problematize, recast, and reignite discussions of definitions of terrorism, causes of terrorism, and responses to terrorism. More specifically, my research into cyberterrorism is lined with, excuse me, I need to slow down, I tend to speak really fast, is in line with contemporary constructivist explorations. So how discursive imaginaries play in the invention of the terrorism threat. So this links with a lot of other literature, probably most famously in terms of terrorism studies, Richard Jackson, Judith Butler, Lee Jarvis, just to plug him again, and that kind of thing. So my hope is that my research into cyberterrorism not only moves this debate into the domain of cyberterrorism, which I think is becoming even more and more important and is more used in kind of political discourse. So obviously that's the kind of first step. And the second step is to kind of move cyberterrorism research on from thinking about, is this threat real or not, and looking at, well, where did it come from? And I think actually recent survey work by the Cyberterrorism Project, just to plug ourselves, has already shown how important discourses are and how they can pose interesting new research avenues for constructivist work. So, my empirical findings then. So, for the purpose of this presentation, as I already said, I'm going to focus just on the top official writing of cyberterrorism as a national security threat. But the other 2 sections of my empirical analysis is the writing of cyber-terrorists, so in terms of who is being referred to and how the enemy is created. And in fact, what I've found so far is that this very much clearly sits with the terrorism discourse as a whole. And second, well, thirdly here, is the writing of the American response. So how the narratives perform in shaping terrorism and counter-terrorism. So what I'm going to talk about today in the writing of the cyberterrorism threat and what this has meant as a national security threat kind of sets the scene for the other 2 that I will not go into today. So, as I've already said, I've identified 3 key articulatory moments in this writing. The first of these is the representation of cyber threats as a product of temporal discontinuity from previous eras. What do I mean by that? Each administration write their time in office as one characterised by the advent of change and transformation, and one that can be contrasted with the more considered, rational time that preceded it. The second of these moments is the related construction of the US's multifarious borders as more open than ever before, and therefore that the US is more exposed to new threats, of which cyberterrorism is included. And the third moment is the juxtaposition of the benefits and threats from technology. So this weird comparison that I'll show you a little bit later in terms of what we can get from terrorism, from technology, and what problems it causes us. So, starting with temporal discontinuity then, And looking specifically at the Clinton administration, the representation of cyber threats is intertwined with an emphasis on articulating their time in office as being at a moment of transformation for America. The administration's political discourse constructs a modern era, epitomized by a resonant insecurity that is positioned as fundamentally oppositional to the Cold War era before it. So they imagine a new world on America, which brings revolutionary change to all workings of society, and therefore carries uncontrollable change for Americans. This seems to be a real key point, that it's an uncontrollable change, not something that can be stopped. In terms of political and socio-historical context, we can also situate this narrative as reactionary to the uncertainty about America's new role and how this would or should affect US foreign policy. So I put some quotes here, which hopefully you can read. They looked fine on my screen, but I can always give out the slides later. So this will kind of just give you an idea of the narratives. I'm not going to read them through because I'll get shown a red card. But what we can do is place this modern era narrative more explicitly within a political and socio-historical context. So with the end of the Cold War in 1990, questions were raised by politicians, but also by academia and the like, about what America's new role would be and how this would or should affect US foreign policy. So Clinton's construction of the modern era can be understood as a reaction to this uncertainty and an attempt to shape not only US foreign policy in the post-Cold War period, but determine US interests and therefore threats in an uncertain environment. Further, this framing of threats from technology and the internet within the modern new era narrative, or Clinton's modern era, as I've liked to put it, serves to position threats like cyberterrorism as part of this break from the past. So allowing for America's response to these new challenges to be created without a connection to previous threat perceptions and counteractions. So within this establishment of the modern era, Clinton also talks about a free and open society. And this is something that he uses throughout his many speeches and also in the policy documents, a free and open society. And this is the writing of open borders and new threats as a result of globalization. So reflecting on the modern era, the Clinton administration described a US which has unintentionally opened its multifarious borders. So when I talk about Clinton, I'm talking about many representatives of the administration, but he also directly contrasts these vulnerabilities to the previous understandable threats of the Cold War, reinforcing the narrative that America has created a new era, or has entered a new era, more like. This opening up is primarily characterized by the accessibility of technology and the internet, but is also linked to reliance and vulnerability, which is a key part of this narrative. And the representation of advances in information technology as both beneficial and detrimental to America's national security. So moving on from this, there's also this shaping of technology as a force for good or bad. There's this constant call for people to shape the internet, to shape information technology as something for the US to use as positive, rather than to let be taken over as a negative. So we can see this here in the writing of the enemy's use of technology. So we can see phrases here like darkness, the darkest nightmares, primitive hatred. They have a dark underside that must be struggled against. Like the rest of the narrative explored in this discourse, how I approach this framing is through Derrida's inventionalist approach to discourse. So for example, Clinton's narration of his darkest nightmare, the internet and terrorists, does not add up in any natural way to cyber threats, or indeed cyberterrorism. Rather, this language is part of a discursive condition that causes its emergence and understanding. So everything that I've said so far kind of comes up to create this. These examples also demonstrate how understandings of cyber threats are created through relations of difference, which is one of Lacan Mouffe's concepts, using phrases such as, again, darkness, dark underside, and primitive hatred, contrasted then with good, people drawing together, and wonderful technology. Threats from technology and the internet are constructed in opposition to the modern, desirable use of the internet by the US or the everyday citizen. So in this way, these kind of texts, and obviously these are just a snapshot of some that I've found, begin to write cyber enemies and construct political identities which are part of the broader terrorism discourse, which I think most of you will be familiar with. Okay, so before making any conclusions about the Clinton administration, I'm going to move straight on to the George W. Bush administration's presentation and representation of cyberterrorism. So we've already seen a presentation of instability and change, but this is not exclusive to the infancy of the integration of new technology and the internet presented during the Clinton era. The Bush administration also narrate a dawning of a new century of threats being upon them, distinctly different to the last. Where Clinton talked of the modern era, or his modern era as he liked to call it, Bush emphasises the commencement of a 21st century that rids previous assumptions and understandings. As the quotes on this slide show, for the Bush administration, the 21st century represents an age where America's enemies have unparalleled access to 21st century technology, which presents cyberspace as ever more dangerous. Rather than a threat for the future, as the Clinton administration seemed to pose it, threats from technology and the internet are narrated as having evolved to become one of the present. What's interesting about this, however, is despite of these differences, both administrations construct exactly the same cyber threats. What is different is that they are articulated as something new, or specifically for the 21st century. In this way, the Clinton administration's constructions of these threats is completely ignored. So, further, Clinton's term in office is overlooked in the presentations of these threats, with exclusive reference, again, to the Cold War and old-fashioned battles, as a contrast to the threats the US faces today. So Clinton's whole term in office and his representation of the cyber threat is like it never happened. It's never mentioned. So he does not present, or the administration don't present these threats as anything that's been dealt with before, which again emphasises the unsuitability of existing measures and strategies to deal with threats to the US. And this, I think, demonstrates quite clearly how the threat is constructed in order to be understood as something no previous administration has ever had to deal with before. So a complete reframing. Okay. Yeah, I have time. The presentation of a 21st century distinctly different from Clinton's modern era somewhat disappeared, though, from the Bush administration's discourse after the 9/11 attacks. It became the marker of change in terms of American instability and insecurity, and from the moment of 9/11 on, everything was compared kind of pre and post 9/11 rather than pre and post Cold War. A lot of academics obviously have already looked into this, but what 9/11 also did is marked a change in representations of technology and terrorist use of the internet. So we do still see links to the post-Cold War narrative, but it's like after Cold War was taken out, and after 9/11 was put back in. So everything stays the same, apart from those, the use of the two frames. The Bush administration also construct understandings of cyber threats from US vulnerability as a result of these open borders that I talked about before, and the movement towards a more open, globalized world in a similar vein to the Clinton administration. And again, they depict this as a result of globalization, but they also emphasize America's reliance on technology, and in particular the overuse of the internet by American citizens in their everyday lives. And again, we can see from remarks on the slide, if you can see them at all, that both individual dependency and national reliance on technology for critical infrastructure is emphasized. So for example, you can't see this at all, but in the second part of Rice's speech here in 2001, we can see that both individual dependency and national reliance on technology for critical infrastructure is emphasized. It's also clear that she claims the newness of these threats is also integral to the uniqueness of these problems. And the narrative works as somewhat of a justification for government spending and on presenting the importance of counter-terrorism efforts in cyberspace. It's worth noting here that these appointments that she talks about, because this speech is taken from an announcement of new cyber appointments, that these are new appointments. They're not replacements, but new positions. So again, encapsulates the theme running through this presentation of cyber threats under the blanket of the US new-founded vulnerability, so a need to change old ways and old frameworks. So I've kind of rushed through that, but just to finish this presentation, what I would like to do is present a number of questions and suggestions for why this sort of critical research is important. I think it would be easy to say, well, okay, and I've asked myself the same question. So I found these these different tropes, these different narratives, what does this mean? Well, in the introduction to this presentation, I stated that the construction of cyberterrorism is part of a broader framing that serves to create space for both writing cyberterrorists and the US response. Through the empirical data I have collected and what I've highlighted today, I've shown that the writing of cyberterrorism as a national security threat in US political discourse is not the result of some natural consequence, but rather a result of historical, political and social context. So we can see, for example, the change from the Clintons' representation of it to the Bush administration's representation of it as a want to reframe their term in office. I argue that by deconstructing the course to understandings of cyberterrorism, it is possible, therefore, to identify alternative meanings and make space for less dominant discourses. So by revealing this construction, then, we're able then to ask different questions about cyberterrorism. So, what policy responses have these representations of cyberterrorism made possible? What's changed, if you like? What does this construction of cyberterrorism in US political discourse do in terms of apportioning responsibility and responding to challenges? What actors are targeted? So who have we created in terms of the cyberterrorism threat? Who are we talking about? Who do we think of? And what does this narration of the threat mean? And it's these kind of questions that I think personally, and I'm sure quite a few in the room might argue with me about it, and I look forward to that, I think moves us forward in terrorism studies from merely researching what is presented to us, so what politicians say or what the media say, etc., to looking beyond these constructions to reveal how and why certain meanings become hegemonic and what this therefore means consequently. Thank you very much.